like to explain on this one. So we talked about this idea of connections being very plastic. So you could think about, if I connect with Leah here, so this is my axon, and this is the synapse where my hand is on her shoulder, and if let's say it's there on that sort of sprout of her, that's her dendrite, and if she touches somebody else, like Kevin, then that's a synapse. So here's a thought from neuron to neuron to neuron. Now, it's, as the previous slide this morning said, it's the sprouting of the axons that is somewhat plastic, and it's the forming of that connection, like that touch, that is somewhat plastic. So I think this is the slide that we finished with. And when I say connections, that's what I mean, is that synapse, that where one sprout of a neuron touches the input sprout of another neuron. And then I talked about myelination. So you remember what that is? That's the sort of covering of the nerve that means that the impulse passes quicker down the nerve. Okay, so demyelinating. So some horrible diseases like multiple sclerosis is a demyelinating condition of the central nervous system, which means that they've got neurons, but they don't transmit very quickly. And because neurons are heat sensitive, if they really get hot, the transmission slows down even more. So it's perfectly legitimate for someone with MS to need air conditioning all the time, for example, because they can actually become, like almost paralyzed in the heat because of the transmission slows to the point where they don't have it enough. Unfortunately, with MS, if it keeps going, the axons start to degenerate as well. So it's a shit of a disease. There's no other way to say it. It's just horrible. Okay, so if we want to talk about neuroplasticity of the brain, and remember, it's learning. Learning is based on neuroplasticity. Unlearning is based on neuroplasticity. So forgetting, it's still a change in the brain when a connection fails. And faulty connections are still neuroplastic. So there's this thing on this slide. It's kind of a weird slide where the top bit is like a cross section, like the brain is like an boiled egg, and you've chopped through the middle of it like that, and you're looking down on the surface. So let's say that's the one on the left up the top is the brain at birth. It's very, very simple inside. And then at 6 weeks, it's very much denser. And then at adult, it's less dense, but it's more distributed. So underneath, it's sort of a schematic of how many, like the number of neurons and the number of kind of sprouted axons. And so the number of arms, like my arm touching Leah's arm, those sorts of sproutings, they proliferate. The axons and the dendrites proliferate. And then they form a lot of synapses, a lot of connections. But then there's this process of synaptic pruning. So the adult brain looks actually tidier than a 6-year-old brain. There's a big process of pruning. Pruning starts around 4, and another process of pruning starts around in the teen years. And it's really necessary because Yeah, after that. So it's got a maximum density in year 9, and then they start pruning. You start getting order because they're just chaos. And then they're also myelinating. So they're getting more efficient in their processes. So neurons can regrow axons, they can regrow dendrites, and they can form new synapses and lose synapses, and the synapses can change strength. That is relatively new information. So that's why everyone's excited about neuroplasticity, because before that we actually did think that the wiring of the brain, so these little arms, were like the wiring of a building. Once it's done, like hardwired, and they didn't change. And now we know that that's not true. And And we're starting to understand a bit more about what promotes that in a positive direction and what hinders it and what promotes it in a negative kind of direction. So let's have a look at the next slide. So see down the bottom, in the picture, the round bit is the axon, as the neuron body, and then coming out of it is the axon coming towards us. And see that red bit is a synapse. So there's like these little buttons actually. A synapse can look like a button. One button touching another button. So the button that's closest to us, that's quite red, and then the branch coming towards us is the dendrite of a synapse, is sort of behind us, if that makes sense. So that's a virtual one. Yeah. I'll show you a little film of a real one in a Petri dish tomorrow. Yeah. So the physiology of this, so the actual cellular issues, is that synapses, the connections between these brain cells, can resume lost function. So they might be temporarily silent and then they start connecting again, or they can become hyper effective, meaning that they'll have either more neurotransmitters on the output side, and or more receptors on the input side. So they're actually they have a greater acuity. They have both a greater capacity to transmit and a greater receptivity. So they can become hyper effective. Or we have a lot of silent or unused synapses that can become unmasked. So these are the building blocks of neuroplasticity. This changes in synaptic connectivity. That's at the synaptic level. Now there's some more sort of system level changes that can happen in the brain, like this thing called redundant circuitry. So functional reorganization in the brain, where other whole sections of the brain can take up a function that they're not traditionally interested in. And that was news, big news in the 80s, where particularly a couple of a neurologist called Paul Bacchi-Rita and a couple of neurophysiologists like Merzenich and a few other old granddaddies like that did all these amazing experiments in the States in particular. So Bacchi-Rita was very interested in tricking other parts of the brain to pick up different functions. One of the, there's a whole bunch of really seminal experiments, but one of the ones that really blew all of our heads off really was that, if anyone who studied neuroanatomy, the most basic thing, the occipital lobes are for vision. It's just basic. It's the most basic labeling on a brain map. And what they found with MRI, so really careful imaging, when they looked at the brains of people who have never had sight, so blind from birth, when they read Braille with their fingertips, so this is a tactile input, if we did it, so we can all, with us sighted people, if we learned Braille, we would process that, but we'd process that in a somatosensory part. It would go to the sensory cortex, which is here, parietal, and then it would sort of loop around a bit, and then it would go into language centers and so forth. And if we read, it goes to the occipital cortex, like visual goes there, and then comes back for naming and language and all the rest of it. These people with Braille who'd never had sight, they were processing a tactile input in their occipital lobes. And they are super sensitive. So they kind of not only, and they had a whole redundant part of their brain. Redundant meaning it wasn't used, it wasn't necessary. And so they very cleverly, not consciously, their brains started using this unused real estate to process tactile stuff. Now that was previously thought to be completely impossible because we thought that it was hardwired, that everybody processed sensory input, tactile sensory, in the tactile sensory areas of the brain. So this major functional reorganization that just blew everybody's heads off, because it was just not thought to be possible. And then it's been shown to be somewhat possible under other less extraordinary circumstances, like somebody being blind. So, for example, what we can show very quickly, very easily, if we had a brain a mapping thing here. We do a lot with motor evoked potentials is if we stimulate a couple of little muscles in the thumb electrically, and then we map the area of the brain in the motor homunculus, which you've all read about. We map how big that territory is. We only have to stimulate here for a couple of minutes and that map gets bigger, and it will last for about an hour or more. So it's very simple. It's very simple. Now, does it functionally make a difference? Yeah, probably not. But it's very simple to make a change in the homunculus. Now, certainly when I was at uni, the homunculus was a fixed little man. Like the area, reading the article that Zoran, the Blakesley one, with all the Penfield sort of experiments, that he was a neurophysiologist who zapped little parts of the brain to map the homunculus. It was thought to be absolutely fixed, but it's not. That homunculus can change depending on need and use. So, and there's competition for neurons between the borders. So say there's a border let's say there's kind of like a territory for the thumb and this finger and this finger and this finger and this finger. Merzenich et al. Did a lot of experiments with monkeys where they amputated that finger and then remapped the motor and the sensory homunculus. And the neurons that previously were devoted to this finger and the homunculus, some of them became interested in sensing and moving this finger, some this finger, and some the palm of the hand. There's a small island that remained, sort of unaligned to anything. And it's thought that probably those ones that don't now have a function, then probably responsible for creating the limb pain and all that sort of stuff, because idle hands get up to mischief. So it's that kind of use it or lose it thing. And even if you have your arm in plaster, and they've done this experimentally, the arm part of your homunculus will get smaller, because as soon as you come out of the plaster and you start using it, the homunculus in that area gets bigger. So it's use dependent, and this is really important. So if we go to the next one, it's present throughout life. This ability for the brain to change like this. So not only for the synapses to change, which is the first thing, but for areas of the brain to shift allegiance up to a point is the second thing. It's possible to do. Now, obviously, there are windows when it's more possible than other times. And there are critical periods in a child's development when it's easier to learn a language, sort of around, by the age of 3, like children's brains for learning languages are really plastic, sort of anywhere between 2 and 5. There's obviously a kind of critical period for walking before that. It doesn't mean that you can't learn afterwards, it's just harder. And so it's stimulated by activity and demand, and it's stimulated by the environment. And if you don't use aspects of function, they diminish. So it's a use it or lose it. And neuroplastic changes are triggered best when it's related to another associated connection. So this associativity is a really important part of neuroplasticity. Other networks, so something that's similar, you're more likely to learn. And it sounds a bit of a paradox, but novel actions that require choice, focused attention and making decisions involve more brain activity than routine actions, which kind of makes sense. So there's a bit of a furphy, which drives us nuts in a research thing about people think if more of your brain lights up, that's better. Well, actually, when you're learning something new, more of your brain lights up. When you've learnt it really well, less of your brain lights up. So just FYI, it's an efficiency. Yeah. And it kind of reflects automaticity. Yeah. Because the brain is it's a very demanding beast energetically. So you use it to improve it. You keep practicing in order to make the synaptic patterns more efficient. Okay. So the next slide, is that it? Okay. So what we might do for homework is there's quite a good article. It's getting a little bit old now, by a couple of folk in the States who've tried to think carefully about the neuroplastic literature and what are the conditions that support neuroplasticity in a positive direction. And it's things like use it or lose it. You know, what you train is what you gain and stuff like that. That seems to be related to predominantly animal studies, I'd have to say, about when the brain changes positively. Why do I keep saying positively? Is that neuroplasticity is not always a fantastic thing. You know, like phantom limb pain is a classic where the brain is this changed and it's just making shit up. You know, it's making stuff up. Centralization of pain is probably is a perverse neuroplastic set of changes in the brain where the brain is making all sorts of associations and sensory hallucinations that are incredibly real but very naughty. Tinnitus, same thing. Who's got tinnitus? So, you know, you'd swear you've got noise in your head. There is no noise, but your brain, you can drive yourself crazy with the noise, just like you can drive yourself crazy with the pain. So it's not, you can say, oh, it's all in your head, it's all in your mind. Well, duh. Yes, it is, but that's how unbenign neuroplasticity can be, if that's a word. Dizziness is a movement hallucination. So we have all of these sensory stimuli that the brain actually is making up, but it doesn't mean that they're not real. Do you know what I mean? Because nothing, in the sense that nothing's real to the brain. The brain's making it all up. All of everything that you're looking at now, the brain is kind of cutting corners, making up, and you know, you've got blind spots and the brain just fills them in. It's just, the brain is the biggest fake artist in the world. You know, we could get very philosophical about reality, but that's the truth of it, actually, is the brain is only making up a fake world in your head. So what does that mean for us in terms of neuroplasticity? In neuroplasticity learning, we're trying to channel these changes in a positive direction. And we're doing that very explicitly by getting people to make choices around pleasure, around what feels better. So we're training the brain to look for changes that have a positive meaning in that sense. So we're not training the brain to be, you know, the insidious thing that pain does is trains the brain to pay attention to the brain, to the pain. You know, it's such a demanding beast. And we're trying to counteract that tendency and train to look and sense something different. So, you know, all of the stories that Deutsch has got in his book are interesting. Do I suggest you read it? Sure, why not? Do all my clients read it? Sure. They've even bought it for me and given it to me. I loaned it. Huh? Yeah, I will send it to you because I think I've got permission to. Yeah, I've got permission to do it. So that we can have a conversation about recognizing what is in the method that also tallies with what's in the literature about this. However, from, you know, the neuroplasticity, the physiology side of it, which interests us as neuroscientists, for you as learning felicitators, you're really interested in the learning stuff, like the language that I used earlier this morning. You know, that language is the sort of movement science language of learning. So neuroplasticity for us is like, yeah, of course the brain can do that. Feldenkrais kind of knew it, even though he talks about all this other shit in body and mature behavior. He actually knew this because all of the method speaks to this, doesn't speak to all this reflex nonsense that he talks about in the other books. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. Look, there's some really good parts of it. So, okay, we'll just take this off, Mike.